please. Before we start the daily routine today, I would like to read a ruling on yesterday. There was, I advised the host that I wanted to look more closely at some of the petitions that were presented, as I thought they didn't sound like they were in proper form. There were 5 petitions tabled. 3 were in order as they were requesting various things. One was a petition for the repaving of a road. The second asked the host of assembly to use its powers with respect to the URAB. The third was a petition to have a road paved. The other 2, however, were not proper petitions to the host of assembly. The first was titled a petition to the Electoral Boundaries Commission, in that the body of the petition, it urged the Electoral Boundary Commission to take certain action. It was not addressed to the host of assembly. It did not request anything from the host of assembly. The second one was set out as a petition opposing the Boundary Commission's recommendation. It was a statement of opposition to the commission, not a request to the host to take action. Petitions have to ask for something, usually some sort of action by the host of assembly. I have made this clear on a number of occasions. These 2 petitions were out of order, and I will have the clerk return them to the members who tabled them. I want to repeat that there is a web page on the legislative website that sets out clearly the requirements for petitions. If improper petitions continue to be tabled, I will ask the clerk to prepare and circulate a more detailed procedural note like the ones that I circulated on several issues last year. Thank you. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I stand today on a point of privilege. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if you could look into the matter to look at a ruling on the propriety of a letter written by the Honourable Minister of Justice on June 14, 2012, which I believe violates the privileges of the members of this House. The letter, as discussed in QP, and I will table another copy, was written to the Electoral Boundaries Commission and gives firm direction. The Minister neither sought nor received any direction from the House, this House of Assembly, in advance of sending the letter. You, sir, advised the Electoral Boundaries Commission on February 28, 2012 that they could accept no direction from anyone unless it came from the House itself. The Commission is vested with authority by this legislature, but its principal mandate is established by the House of Assembly's Act. It must be independent. Independence of such a body is a hallmark of modern democracy and is supposed to prevent political considerations from entering into the setting of boundaries. It is immaterial whether one agrees whether the position of the minister of the position that is expressed in the letter. He simply had no right to make or send such a letter, as your own letter to the Commission makes clear. The law of the province and the enabling resolutions of this House and Select Committee of this House were violated by the letter issuing directions to the Independent Commission. Because the minister chose not to follow the rules and bypass the House, my privileges and that of all members of this House were breached. If members can do that, it's a horrible precedence, Mr. Speaker. It will be said that will gut the concept of independence and usurp the role of the House. If ministers of the Crown can instruct an independent body, where does it stop? What independent bodies will be next? Other commissions, tribunals, adjudicative boards, courts? If we allow it in this case, we open the door to future ministers saying whatever the opinion might be, right or wrong, in law or in fact, to whatever independent body, and regardless of whether the House would share such a view. I therefore respectfully request that you find the minister breach my privileges as a member by taking it upon himself to give direction to a body of the House established to be independent of anyone's direction.
Good. The Honourable Leader, Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know you will judge wisely and fairly. Quite simply put, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice acted well within the bounds of his office, within the direction that was given to the committee, and everything else I would assert put forward by the House Leader for the third party was just a bit of fluff to make it a little longer than what it should be. But I think when you look at it in its entirety, that you will find out that the Minister of Justice acted well within the bounds of his office and nobody's privilege was violated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would disagree respectfully with the Deputy Premier and agree with the member for Argyll. I think he's made a very strong case. I was a member of that select committee with the member from Argyll, and your direction, Mr. Speaker, was very clear to the Commission. And I think that the most important part of this is not only for this boundary review going forward, but as well, the member for Argyll has pointed out, it's for what happens with other similar independent committees, and I think that in this case, your ruling is extremely important in this case, and I would hope you, and I know you will look into this very thoughtfully.
Thank you. I will take the matter today under advisement, and I will report back to the hosts as early as I can. I will have my staff look into the matter. Thank you very much. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition of which the operating clause reads, the Nova Scotia government is committed to protect 12% of Crown land in Nova Scotia by 2015. At present, approximately 38% of Crown land in southwest Nova Scotia is already under protection. Reed, Tobiatic Wilderness Area, plus some others. The government is now proposing another 100,000 plus acres in southwest Nova be protected. We are asking the government for a moratorium on any further protected area in southwest Nova, as we feel we have already given our share. Mr. Speaker, I've affixed my signature, and there are 2,631 signatories on this petition.
The petition is tabled. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition which, with the operative clause, we, the undersigned electors, citizens and residents of the province of Nova Scotia, draw the attention of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly and the Board of Commissioners of Public Utilities to the following, that we are adamantly against any increase in the existing residential rate structure for Nova Scotia Power Incorporated, and that we feel with the huge net profits collected by NSPI under existing rates and the protection of the fuel adjustment mechanism that NSPI currently enjoys, any increase to current residential rates is pure greed and usury on the part of NSPI and its shareholders. Mr. Speaker, there are 104 names on this part of the petition, and I have affixed my signature.
Order, please. Can I please see a copy of that, please? I just want to know there's an ask of the host of assembly on that petition. Okay. Yeah, I think there is an ask of the host of assembly on this petition, but it wasn't sent by the honourable member when he read the petition. I would ask the honourable member, is this a part of the petition that was read yesterday in the host of assembly? Is this a part of the petition that was read yesterday in the House of Assembly? Yes. Okay. I think there's a precedent-setting case here, and I looked into this last night at, tabling parts of petition. I think I'll ask my staff to look into tabling parts of petitions in the House of Assembly, and I will report back to the House as early as next week on this issue, okay? Thank you. And I would ask all the honourable members if I could have a little bit of silence when they're reading petitions. It's very difficult to hear the operative clause and hear what the ask of the House of Assembly is with all the chatter going on. So I will now recognize the honourable member for King North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to present a petition. The operative clause reads as follows. The undersigned use Weaver Road extension, consider the road to be in extremely poor condition, and call on the provincial government to repair and repave the road. It's been signed by 34 citizens of the area, and I have added my signature to the document.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas Breast Reconstruction Awareness, or BRAW Day, is an initiative designed to promote education, awareness, and access for women who may wish to consider post-mastectomy breast reconstruction. And whereas this decision to have breast reconstruction surgery is extremely personal and is about helping women heal from the emotional and physical scars of breast cancer. And whereas Broad Day was first celebrated in Canada and now in America every October 17th, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in acknowledging every October 17th as Breast Reconstruction Awareness Day and continue to spread awareness about this important date. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Review of the Green Energy Equipment Tax Credit in Manitoba for implementation in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Review of the Green Energy Equipment Tax Credit in Manitoba for implementation in Nova Scotia.
Bill number 100, an act respecting the review of the Green Energy Equipment Tax Credit in Manitoba for implementation in Nova Scotia.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act.
Bill number 101, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotians are struggling under this NDP government and are facing layoffs and job insecurity due to the mismanagement of the economy, and whereas the NDP government seems only able to write big checks to big companies with $590 million handed out to 6 companies alone, and whereas in total those companies laid off over 1,300 Nova Scotians after cashing the checks handed to them by the Premier, therefore be it resolved that the member for Sackville-Cobequid urge the Premier to rethink his failed model of corporate handouts and work to diversify the provincial economy and remind him that a strong economy is a diversified economy. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October is Women's History Month, a time to celebrate the valuable contribution made by women and girls throughout our history. And whereas the theme of this year's celebration is centered around the important roles that Canadian women have played as innovators throughout our country. And whereas October 11th marked the world's first International Day of the Girl, declared by the United Nations in an effort to give a powerful voice to girls and young women to make changes in their families, communities, and others. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize Women's History Month and the International Day of the Girl and encourage women everywhere to make a difference and add to the invaluable contributions made by women before them. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cassio Clayton, a 24-year-old boxer from the community of North Preston, began his boxing career at the age of 9, having his first amateur bout at the age of 11, and winning his first 3 national championships at the age of 13 years. And whereas he qualified for the Olympics in the past May with a 5th place finish in the 69-kilogram class at the American Zone qualifiers in Brazil, whereas he earned the right to represent Canada in the London Olympics and won his first bout against Mexico, his second bout against Australia, and lost the decision to Great Britain in his third bout after ending up in an even on the judges' points counts. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House join me in recognizing the excellent contribution that Cassio Clayton made to boxing for Canada and for his home province of Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate. And I would like to say one other thing about this young gentleman, if I could. He's an incredible sportsman. His reaction at the Olympics when he's lost, and it was in the paper, the whole story about it is incredible. And when you sit down and talk to him, you realize what kind of a quality representative he is for our community, he is for the province, and indeed for Canada. And we don't often see individuals of his character and caliber at any level, at any professional situation we see. So I would like to personally thank him, and I know the members of the legislature would, for the excellent job he has done representing our province and our country.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyle.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to introduce a number of people in the gallery today. J'aimerais faire une introduction de quelques membres dans l'Assemblée aujourd'hui. And I'll ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of the House. Justin Murray, President of the Acadian Federation, Président de la FAN. Marie-Claude Rioux, Directrice Générale de la FAN. Cyrilda Poirier, Fédération des francophones de Terre-Neuve et Labrador, from Newfoundland and Labrador. Bridget Schmidt, Réseau Santé Nouvelle-Écosse. Karine Lahaye, Fédération des femmes. Et Lorraine Plourde, Réseau Acadien des CITPAC. You can pass that off to them. I'd like to give them the warm welcome of the House and thank them for being here.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this morning's proceedings. I will now introduce the honourable member for Argyle for his resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, une date ultérieure, je demande l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que le 16 septembre, Greenwood, Paul Moulaison de la rivière Abraham a été officiellement admis au temple de la renommée de la musique country de la Nouvelle-Écosse. Attendu qu'il y a presque 60 ans que Paul joue la musique et continue encore autant qu'il peut aujourd'hui pour les prélèvements de fonds et pour ceux et celles en besoin. Et attendu que Paul a travaillé pour 41 ans à bord du MV Blue Nose comme un cuisinier et continue aujourd'hui à travailler à temps partiel dans un restaurant local. Par conséquent, qu'il soit résolu de tous les membres de cette Assemblée félicite Paul Moulaison pour avoir été admis au temple de la renommée de la musique de country de la Nouvelle-Écosse et souhaite le succès continu et la bonne santé à l'avenir. Monsieur le Président, je demande l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future date to move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas on September 16th in Greenwood, Paul Moulaison from Abrams River was officially inducted into the Nova Scotia Country Music Hall of Fame. And whereas Paul has been playing music for almost 60 years and continues to do so as often as he can, but usually for benefits to assist people in need. And whereas Paul worked for 41 years aboard the MV Blue Nose as a cook and continues to work part-time as a cook at a local restaurant. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Paul Moulaison on his induction into the Nova Scotia Country Music Hall of Fame and wish him continued good health and success into the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Gloria McCluskey has a distinguished history representing the citizens of Dartmouth, first as an alderman, the deputy mayor, Gloria and I are friends, and mayor, and then currently serves as councillor for District 5, Dartmouth Centre. And whereas before entering politics, Gloria McCluskey was appointed as the first female accredited appraiser in Nova Scotia by the Appraisal Institute of Canada in 1972. And whereas on October 14th, 2012, Ms. McCluskey was awarded an honorary degree by St. Mary's University for her contribution to public service as both a politician and her work in the community. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize Gloria McCluskey for her continued commitment and dedication to the people of Dartmouth and join me in congratulating her on this well-deserved honour. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kenneth Carmichael from Sydney River placed 8th in the Great Canadian Geography Challenge, and whereas Kenneth is a student at Malcolm Monroe Junior High School with an avid interest in geography, and whereas this is Kenneth's second consecutive top 10 finish in the Great Canadian Geography Challenge, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Kenneth Carmichael and wish him well with his future education. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jason McCombs is a Canadian sprint canoeist who races at Banook Canoe Club in Dartmouth. And whereas Jason represented Canada this past summer at the 2012 Olympic Games held in London, England. And whereas Jason competed in the C1 200 metres at Eton Dorney and finished 5th in the B final. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating Jason on his outstanding achievements in London and wish him all the best as he prepares for Rio de Janeiro in 2016. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Denise Joyce organized an event called Love Yourself this past summer in Sydney Mines after she encountered many women that had had a bad self-image of themselves. And whereas Denise organized a special photo and video shoot at the Pitt Street Ball Field with life and healing energy coach Denise P. Morrison as guest speaker. And whereas close to 500 women attended and left feeling empowered and increased their self-esteem and self-awareness at this event. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the 500 women that Denise Joyce was able to empower and hope that her event will become an annual tradition in Sydney Mines. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Clarence Bentley Sutherland applied to the Royal Canadian Air Force 7 times before being accepted because of an eye defect, and whereas Larry Sutherland flew 35 missions during the Second World War as a rear gunner in a Lancaster heavy bomber, flying all but one mission at night, participated in 9 of the 19 infamous Berlin raids, became known as Canada's heavy bomber air gunner ace, and received 2 distinguished flying medals for service to his country. And whereas Sutherland, at age 89, was given a final salute at his burial service at the Crossroads Cemetery in Valley, Colchester North, this summer. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly express our sorrow at the death of this World War II hero who performed so many amazing and dangerous feats in the service of his country. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year the flu affects between 5 and 10% of Canadians and results in an average of 20,000 hospitalizations each year. And whereas Nova Scotians recognize October as Influenza Immunization Awareness Month to remind Nova Scotians to take preventive measures to protect themselves by getting a flu shot. And whereas more Nova Scotians would have access to life-saving flu shots if the NDP government followed through on their commitment to allow pharmacists to administer the flu shot. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly encourage Nova Scotians to get their flu shot and encourage the NDP government to follow through on a commitment that could help save lives. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 6th annual Coal Shed Music Festival took place from August 16th to 19th and August 23rd to 26th in Yarmouth, and whereas this year's Coal Shed Music Festival was the largest one to date, featuring over 100 musical acts over an 8-day period on the Coal Shed stage at the Killam Brothers Wharf on Yarmouth's beautiful waterfront, and whereas Phil DeMille created the event as a fundraiser for the Yarmouth Food Bank and dedicates so much of his time and energy to organizing the festival, which last year raised almost $10,000 for the Yarmouth Food Bank and local school breakfast programs. Therefore, be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly recognize Phil DeMille for his tireless efforts in organizing the Coal Shed Music Festival and thank him for his dedication to his community, especially to those in need. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Wayne Folker first ran for a seat on Hantsport Town Council in 1972 at the tender age of 38. And whereas Folker served his initial 13 years as a councillor and deputy mayor before leaving for 6 years between 85 and 91. And whereas Folker then returned to active municipal politics in Hantsport in 1991 when he began serving as the town's mayor, a position he held for the next 21 years before deciding not to reoffer this fall. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Wayne Folker of Hantsport for his distinguished leadership over the course of 34 years in municipal politics in Hantsport, while wishing him and his wife Carolyn the very best in their retirement years. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Tuesday, June 26, 2012, a ceremony was held on the Digby waterfront to honor retired Judge John R. Nichols. And whereas the 2012 Joe Casey Humanitarian Award was presented to Nichols for his contributions to the community in both organizations and career. And whereas Nichols continues to be active in many organizations, therefore confirming that he indeed deserves the 2012 Joe Casey Humanitarian Award. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating John R. Nichols on this award and wish him all the best in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 22 Nova Scotia students have been chosen to receive the 2012 Pengrowth Nova Scotia Energy Scholarships, and whereas the scholarship is designed to develop homegrown expertise by encouraging Nova Scotia students to pursue careers in the energy sector, and whereas Catherine Kaiser, a graduate of Badek Academy, presently enrolled in Dalhousie University, is one of the proud recipients of this award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Catherine and all recipients of the Pengrowth Scholarships and wish them the best in their future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday's decision by the National Research Council, the Government of Canada's premier organization for research and development, to close the NRC's medical device lab in Halifax came as a shock to our province. And whereas the loss of this lab will hurt medical school training, will result in the loss of expertise and leading-edge technology, and will have a significant impact on those life sciences companies that are truly making a difference in the health and well-being of not only Nova Scotians, but people all over the world. Whereas the life sciences industry in Nova Scotia is a significant contributor to our economy, with the research component of the industry employing 2,365 employees, with a total payroll of over $135 million. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature acknowledge the importance of this critical piece of research infrastructure to our province by putting pen to paper and writing both the National Research Council and the Prime Minister outlining both our disappointment of this decision and requesting reconsideration of this short-sighted decision. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in the past year, Nova Scotia has shed 8,600 full-time jobs, and some areas of the province have unemployment rates of 15%. And whereas the Extended Employment Insurance Benefits Pilot Project increased income support by providing an additional 5 weeks of benefits to a maximum of 45 weeks in 21 economic regions across Canada. And whereas the federal government concluded this program in mid-September, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House call on the federal government to reconsider the conclusion of the Extended Employment Insurance Benefits Program, especially in regions that continue to suffer from high unemployment, as many in NDP-led provinces do. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Premier has handed out over $500 million in taxpayer money to 6 companies with no job guarantees and with no assurance that taxpayers will ever see this money again. And whereas the Premier has written these multi-million-dollar checks to big corporations at the same time as he has hiked fees and taxes and gutted essential programs such as education. And whereas after receiving over $500 million in taxpayers' money, 3 of these companies shut down or went bankrupt, 1 of them is on the brink of closure, and all 6 laid off employees. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage remind the Premier that he cannot grow the economy by simply writing blank checks to big corporations, and that he must end his corporate handouts and begin work on growing the economies of this province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver.
Passage.
And passage without debate.
Thank you. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October is Lupus Awareness Month, and whereas lupus is a chronic autoimmune disease that affects more than 1 in 1,000 Canadians, and whereas while no cure for lupus yet exists, research has come a long way in providing proper treatment and helping individuals affected by this disease live healthier lives. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly commend those working hard to uncover a cure for this disease and thank the many volunteers with Lupus Canada for raising awareness. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas throughout the years, family-operated businesses have become a tradition in Nova Scotia and have served the needs of community residents, and whereas Homer Barnhill purchased what became Barnhill's General Store in Debert, Colchester North in 1921, his son Wendell took over the store in 1961, and then his son Randy in 1983. And whereas the building of the military base at Camp Debert kept the business busy, especially during World War II, and by diversifying services, the business continues to prosper. Therefore, it be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Barnhill family for their service to the community and for carrying on the tradition of the family-run local business. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Scouts Apple Day is a traditional fundraising event that began in Canada, and whereas Apple Day is an annual event that provides scouting youth with an opportunity to show their appreciation to the general public for their support throughout the year, and whereas any money raised during Apple Day goes towards improving the scouting program through registration fee subsidies, outings, camping equipment, training, and many other endeavours. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly support the scouting movement in Nova Scotia by enjoying an apple and giving generously to the hundreds of scouting youth who are taking part in Apple Day efforts. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Lionel Landry has been a dedicated supporter and volunteer of the Yarmouth Liberal Association and has been a proud Liberal for over 50 years, and whereas Mr. Landry always arrives at meetings and events happy to lend a kind word and a helping hand, and whereas Mr. Landry's dedication to his party has been a source of inspiration and support to many candidates as they seek office and those who have held office, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly recognize Lionel Landry for his dedication and commitment to the Yarmouth Liberal Association, the Nova Scotia Liberal Party and the Liberal Party of Canada, and his devotion to the welfare of his community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the dedication and official return of the St. Paul's Southwest Light took place on August 4th, 2012. And whereas the original St. Paul's Southwest Lighthouse was erected in 1839 and after a fire was replaced in 1917 with a steel cylindrical lighthouse. And whereas St. Paul's Southwest now stands in its home port overlooking St. Paul's Island, known as the Graveyard of the Gulf, as Canada's first heritage lighthouse. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the St. Paul's Heritage Society Board for their dedication and commitment to preserving and safeguarding Canada's first heritage lighthouse and having it in its rightful place. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Premier has handed out over $500 million in taxpayers' money to 6 companies with no job guarantees, with no assurance that taxpayers will ever see this money again. Whereas the Premier has written multi-million-dollar checks to big corporations at the same time, he has hiked taxes and fees and gutted the essential programs such as education. And whereas after receiving $500 million in taxpayers' money, 3 of them have shut down or went bankrupt, 1 of them is on the brink of closure, and all 6 have laid off employees. Therefore, resolved that the member for Chester St. Margaret still supports the Premier, even though the Premier has proven he cannot grow the economy, by simply writing blank checks to big corporations. They must end his corporate handouts and begin to work on growing the economy and communities across the province. And Mr. Premier, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read this resolution on behalf of the member from Inverness.
Most certainly.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Rotary Club of North Sydney celebrated 75 years of service this summer and highlighted by a number of fun-filled days at their annual regatta. And whereas all funds that were raised go to a number of community projects like the local hospital foundation, Project Overseas, and Camp Tidnish in Amherst, that is available to only Nova Scotians with physical disability over the age of 6. And whereas the multiple events at North Sydney Yacht Club and copious amounts of food were enjoyed by all those who attended, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly salute the Rotary Club of North Sydney for its years of community service. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Premier has handed out over $500 million in taxpayer money to 6 companies with no job guarantees and with no assurance that taxpayers will ever see this money again, and whereas the Premier has written these multi-million-dollar checks to big corporations at the same time as he has hiked taxes and fees and gutted essential programs such as education, and whereas after receiving over $500 million in taxpayers' money, 3 of them shut down or went bankrupt, 1 of them is on the brink of closure, and all 6 laid off employees. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley remind the Premier that he cannot grow the economy by simply writing blank checks to big corporations, and that he must end his corporate handouts and begin working on growing the economies in communities across the province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment gives several awards to individuals, businesses, and organizations within 3 states and 2 provinces that border the Gulf. And whereas the Council is a partnership of American and Canadian governmental and non-government organizations working to maintain and enchant the environment quality in the Gulf of Maine. And whereas with the Bay of Fundy being part of the Gulf, Roger Ohouse of Freeport received a Visionary Award from the Council for his role in maintaining and enchanting environmental quality. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Roger Ohouse on his impressive award and wish him all the best in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Anaha dulchas agus canon and gale a torch $3 million done economy Alabanue. Agus anish a Grievin na Shawan Rialtasan Arain Ganich and an Erev nan Gael. Agus anaha buig neotrishal and an Gleug canon avans ar duich vohus mara vroyig vrainig leahiad Priv Minister Sir Ian Donawach agus feravan a triaver an Alabanuig unis el Donawach. Martian Kudermich Ryan Gorania Johnny Grialtis Nashenta and Fiach aver Gaelic agus Dulchasan Ella do Canada agus do Minchir. Mr. Speaker, whereas the Gaelic language, Mr. Speaker, Whereas the Gaelic language and culture contribute $32 million each year to the Nova Scotia economy. And whereas the decline of the Gaelic language came as a result of policies of previous government agencies. And whereas there is priceless value in maintaining a founding language of our country, spoken by our father of Confederation and Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, and former Nova Scotia Premier Angus L. Macdonald. Therefore, be it resolved that the federal government recognize the value Gaelic and other ethnic languages bring to Canada and her people. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bob Beattie of Aylesford was recently awarded the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal from the Lieutenant Governor, and whereas Bob has been serving as an RCMP auxiliary constable for over 10 years, first in Berwick, then at the Kingston RCMP detachment, and whereas Bob has served in a volunteer capacity for the Apple Blossom Festival Gala Days and also Remembrance Day, and amasses 400 to 500 hours per year. Therefore, be it resolved, the House of Assembly recognize and congratulate Auxiliary Constable Bob Beattie for his dedication to the Valley community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 18th is commemorated as Persons Day to remember the famous case where women were finally recognized as persons under Canadian law in 1929. And whereas this case challenged the definition of persons which had been used to bar women from appointment to the Senate, and whereas women across Canada owe a tremendous debt to the 5 Albertan women, known as the Famous Five, who had the courage and determination to take this case to the highest court of appeal and establish the rights of women in Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House, and especially the women of this Assembly, acknowledge the huge contribution of the Famous Five: Irene Palby, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinley, Emily Murphy, and Henrietta Edwards on their historic contribution to the rights and privileges of women in Canada. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call bills for second, public bills, government motion, or government bills for second reading, Mr. Speaker?
Public bills, government bills for second reading. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 94, the House of Assembly Act?
Bill 94, the House of Assembly Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 94 be now read for a second time. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure today to talk to an amendment to the House of Assembly Act. Mr. Speaker, the changes I'm introducing today implement changes recommended by the Department of Electoral Boundaries Commission. This is the third time since 1991 that such a commission has been established to review and provide recommendations to the House of Assembly on Nova Scotia's electoral boundaries. Mr. Speaker, this independent review is required under legislation. The House of Assembly Act requires that a review be conducted every 10 years to ensure that legislation representation keeps pace with population growth and movement. The most recent Electoral Boundary Commission was appointed in December 2011. Its mandate was to establish no more than 52 seats that would allow each voter in the province to enjoy the same relative voting power to the greatest extent possible. The Commission was directed to ensure all constituencies fall within 25% of the average number of electors. Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that this was a difficult job, and on behalf of all the members of this House, I thank the Commission for its work completing its report. Nova Scotians have strong feelings about their communities, Mr. Speaker, and that's a good thing. The Commission gave Nova Scotians the opportunity to share their views on electoral boundaries. The feedback was mixed, Mr. Speaker. The varied reactions and opinions of communities and individuals certainly made the Commission's work even more challenging. Despite these challenges, the Commission delivered a final report that met the legally binding terms of reference set by all party legislative committee, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the Commission. This was important work that directly impacts Nova Scotia's democratic process. The final report made recommendations on which these legislative changes are based and included. Reducing the number of seats in the legislature by 1 to 51, removing 1 constituency from Cape Breton and 2 from mainland Nova Scotia, establishing 2 new constituencies for the Halifax area, adjusting the boundaries in all remaining constituencies. I don't think I need to go on into these changes in any more detail than I have. Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure every member of this House has already reviewed the Commission report in full. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that this government believes in the values of relative voting parity and effective representation. We believe that every Nova Scotian's vote, regardless where he or she lives, should be worth roughly the same, recognizing, Mr. Speaker, that minor deviations may be necessary to allow for effective representation. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia before us today and the one to come looks much different than it looked 10 years ago when the last Boundary Commission was doing its work. Changes in population call for shifts in legislative representation. The existing electoral boundaries maintain seats that are much smaller than the provincial average. Some would say this isn't fair, and that's one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, that legislation requires an independent review every 10 years. Every Nova Scotian deserves to be fairly and equitably represented in the House of Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's with mixed feelings that I rise in my place as the member for Richmond and the House Leader of the Liberal Caucus to speak on Bill 94. Speaker, before I get into my comments, I want to start with some of the reaction that I received in my riding of Richmond County, which, as you know, in 1992 was established as one of the protected ridings due to its Acadian culture and to encourage Acadian representation in the House of Assembly. Mr. Speaker, when my constituents saw how this process was unfolding and this government's attack on the Acadian communities by wanting to get rid of our voice here in the legislature, the reaction was, what did we do? What did we do to Premier Dexter? What did we do to this NDP government? How did we make them mad? Why did we upset them? Tell us, what was it we did? Because as I'll point out in my remarks, and anyone who's looked at the statistics of the last number of provincial elections, myself being quite familiar with the last 5 elections, which I've participated in, but other than one election, the top 3 ridings with voter turnout and participation have been Clare, Argyll, and Richmond. Out of 52 ridings in the province of Nova Scotia, the top 3, which has changed amongst the 3 of us as to who had the highest voter turnout, was Clare, Argyll, and Richmond, the protected Acadian constituencies. So the Acadian people are saying, why are we under attack? At a time when voter turnout is low throughout the province, especially in the metropolitan areas, we've been going out 70%, 75%. In one election, I believe Clare had 87% voter turnout. Something to be celebrated. An example for the rest of the province. Yet this government turns around. This government turns around and somehow says, that's not fair. voter participation, in fact, some of the members on the government side were elected with 46 and 47% voter turnout. That's right. Mr. Speaker, I've never been elected with less than 70% voter turnout in Richmond County. And yet somehow a 46% or 49% or 50% voter turnout is equal to the 87% voter turnout. How can the Minister of Justice stand in his place and somehow try to convince Nova Scotians that he's the new self-proclaimed patron saint of voter equality in Nova Scotia? You know, Mr. Speaker, it's ridiculous. I had the opportunity to chair the Select Committee on Democratic Renewal, where we went around the province to try to find ways of encouraging Nova Scotians to vote. And again, the Acadian example was set out and said, why is it that Acadians are going out to vote in such high numbers? Well, I'd submit to you why I think they do that, Mr. Speaker. Because the Acadians see the protected ridings not as a privilege, but as a right. And a right that is not to be abused or neglected, but a right that is to be preserved. And there's no better way to preserve that than to turn out at election time and send a clear message that Acadians don't take these protected ridings for granted. Instead, we're going to go out and vote in large numbers and send a clear signal that this is an important part of our culture, it's an important part of our heritage, it's an important part of our identity, and more importantly, it's an important part of our future. So, Mr. Speaker, let me continue, I should say, by going to a bit of the history of what brought us here today. Nova Scotia as a province does not have a glowing history when it comes to drawing electoral boundaries in the past. The term gerrymandering is one that has been thrown around in this legislature in years gone by because of the fact that the government of the day would in essence decide what electoral boundaries were going to look like. To their credit, in 1992, the government of the day in Nova Scotia said we need to change the way we draw electoral boundaries. We need to take this out of the hands of the elected officials and put it in the hands of independent Nova Scotians to redraw the boundaries, which is in the best interest of communities, not in the best interest of politicians. Mr. Speaker, that was an historic day for our province. And in 1992, a select committee of this House was struck, terms of reference were put in place, and the committee went to do its work. What was unique in the terms of reference in 1992 was that the legislature said, unanimously said, the select committee at the time said, we want to put in a special clause. We want to put in a clause that says that while we expect relative parity of voting power, which means that for the most part you try to make ridings equal size in voters, they said we want to go a step further. Because in Nova Scotia, we're proud of our history, we're proud of our cultures, we're proud of our identity. And at the time, the Select Committee decided that they wanted to try to encourage representation by Acadians, by African Nova Scotians, and by our First Nations communities. So as part of that, they said, while we expect no ridings will go beyond 25% variance in size, they added an extraordinary circumstance clause that said to the Independent Commission, you can establish ridings that are beyond the 25%, mostly below the 25%, if it is to help encourage Acadian representation, African Nova Scotian representation, or First Nation representation. In 1992, the Independent Commission, which was supported by all the parties of the day, came back with the recommendation that the ridings of Clare, Argyll, and Richmond should be given protected status for the encouragement of Acadian representation in the House of Assembly. The riding of Preston was created for the encouragement of the representation of African Nova Scotians in the House of Assembly. And at that time, it was decided that a seat would be set aside for the First Nations community to decide whether they wanted to have a representative from the Aboriginal, the First Nation community here in the House of Assembly. Now we know, Mr. Speaker, that the First Nations community to date have decided not to exercise that right of having a designated seat here in the House of Assembly. So, Mr. Speaker, I hear the Minister of Economic Development over there, and I want to touch on what he's saying. When that commission decided to protect Clare, Argyll, Richmond, and Preston, at no point did that commission say, this is a guarantee that you're going to have Acadians in the legislature and you're going to have members of the African Nova Scotian community. It's impossible. In a free and democratic society, you can't guarantee who is going to be elected by the population, and we'd never want to see the day where that is the case. Yet, what it allowed is those minority communities within those ridings to strengthen their voting power, so that they had the choice of whether they wanted to elect an Acadian or an African Nova Scotian. But if they did not, they still knew that they had voting power. So regardless of who they elected, that minority would have the voting power to hold their member accountable. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you,
Order, please. Order. It is unparliamentary for members to be hollering, whether members in the chamber or outside of the chamber. Not the member for Richmond did not say that. The other members in the caucus. I would remind all members, you cannot say whether a member is in the chamber or outside of the chamber. I will now recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that clarification for all of my colleagues, but I can't imagine who they were referring to. But let me address the comments made by the Minister of Economic Development, who I'm sure is listening very attentively.
Thank you.
For the government today to suggest that the riding of Preston is not working, I believe is offensive. Because to say that the riding of Preston would only work if there was an African Nova Scotian elected is not what the Commission ever intended. And to tell the people of Preston that they're not getting proper representation because they do not have someone from the African Nova Scotian community as their MLA, I think is a disservice to that community. It's a disservice to all Nova Scotians for the government, the Premier, the Minister of Economic Development, or anyone else over there to make that claim. Mr. Speaker, when Richmond was first put as a protected riding in 1992, at the time, we were represented by the Honourable Richie Mann. Richie Mann was not an Acadian. But I'll tell you this, Richie Mann was probably one of the strongest defenders of the Acadian culture that stood in this House of Assembly. And one of the main reasons why, which I'm sure personally he had that commitment to the Acadian community, he also knew the voting power that existed within the confines of Richmond County within the Acadian community. And that was part of the voting power. And I don't think any Acadian would have said at the time, we're not getting good representation because we're a protected riding and we don't have an Acadian representing us. Not one ever said that. And I'd never stand in my place to say it, because Acadians had a great amount of respect for the work that Richie Mann did, the work that he did in supporting cultural centres such as Centre La Picasse, which could not have been done without his support. So to suggest today Preston's not working, well, it's to say Richmond didn't work from 1993 to 1998 because it didn't have an Acadian representing it. That is offensive to me. It's offensive to the people of Richmond County, just as it should be offensive, and it is offensive, to the people of Preston to make that type of suggestion. Mr. Speaker, we live in a free and democratic society where people are free to choose who they vote for. For the Minister of Economic Development to say, well, each party should make sure their candidate comes from a certain culture or a certain background, Mr. Speaker, what does that say for a free and democratic process? Where we tell our party members, if you want to stand for office to represent our party, here are the rules. Now, maybe the NDP have different rules that they're prepared to share with us as to what their candidate process and what the rules are for their candidates in Preston, or in Richmond, or in Argyll. And what's interesting, when I hear the Minister of Economic Development, who I'm sure is listening very attentively after his earlier remarks, I ran in 5 elections in Richmond County. And the candidate for the NDP in those 5 elections, never once was it an Acadian, never once was it someone who could speak French. Wow. But that's who the NDP put as their candidate. Now, did anyone in Richmond say, that's terrible? They should be putting an Acadian. People of Richmond County never said that, because whoever wanted to run for the NDP had a process to follow and was free to do so. So it's hypocritical to turn around and to say the Liberals and the Tories should make sure that their candidate meets a certain criteria when the government has not done it themselves. And I'd never suggest that they should. It's a hollow argument, it's an unfortunate argument, and I think it does nothing to strengthen our democracy. So, Mr. Speaker, that was 1992. In 2002, 10 years later, an independent commission was struck. The terms of reference were in essence identical to what was done in 1992. Again, the goal was that all ridings should be within 25%, but there was a clause that said extraordinary circumstances could exist to go beyond that 25%. What are those extraordinary circumstances? They were representation for the Acadian community, for the African Nova Scotian community, for geographical size, and communities of interest. Ironically, geographical size was applied to a riding of Guysborough, which was a massive riding. And they looked at that as a special consideration. During that process, Mr. Speaker, while I was not named as a member of that committee, I had the opportunity to attend many of its meetings because at the time our government House leader was a member of the committee and the House was sitting, and due to his schedule I was asked to participate. So I had the opportunity to attend most of the public meetings that took place, the work of the Select Committee itself, and to follow through on what the Independent Boundaries Commission did. During their interim report, Mr. Speaker, the Commission had recommended that the riding of Richmond lose its protected status and that the town of Port Hawkesbury be added with the riding of Richmond. So this question was looked at. And what happened is that residents of Richmond County, representatives of the Acadian Federation, had the opportunity to come forward and make their arguments. At the end of the day, the Commission looked, I believe it had its eyes opened as to how important these ridings were to the Acadian culture, the Acadian identity, and in their final report they said, keep Richmond as it is, so we still have the protected ridings of Clare, Argyll, Richmond, and Preston. At the time, Mr. Speaker, the amount of voters in those 4 protected ridings was less than it was back in 1992. And that's a trend, unfortunately, that continues to this day. But at the time, it again received unanimous approval of the House. You can check media reports. I don't believe you'll ever find where any member of the House would say there was political interference in 1992 or in 2002. So that brings us 10 years later. 2011, we have to prepare for the review that will take place in 2012. So it's almost as if, looking back, that this government got caught by surprise. That even though it's mandated to take place every 10 years, which should be of no surprise to no one, the way they came about doing this almost seemed like they were caught off guard and they were rushing to get it done. Mr. Speaker, I was named as a member of the Select Committee of the House of Assembly. My colleague from Dartmouth East was also a member of the Select Committee. I believe the House Leader for the Conservative Caucus, the Honourable Member from Argyll, and I believe the member for Victoria Lakes also were part of that Select Committee. Mr. Speaker, when we first met, it was ironic that I was actually the only member that had actually been involved in the process 10 years previous. So I had the opportunity to provide what I'd like to think was a bit of guidance to the chair, who was new to this whole process, to ensure that we were able to do this in a fair, impartial manner, as was done the previous 2 times. So one of the first mandates that we had was to draft the terms of reference. This is what would guide the independent commission. And that's the language that's used, that they are to be guided by the terms of reference. And that's an argument we'll come back to. And I think you're going to hear that quite a few times in this chamber. So what we went through, Mr. Speaker, was a series of draft reports. And through those draft reports, there was some minor changes made. The government's position when we started was they wanted the variance to be 20%. The 20% is a change from the two previous commissions, which used 25. Now you might ask, what's the difference of 5%? Well, I can tell you, if you represent rural Nova Scotia, that 5% makes a big difference. If you represent a riding like Guysborough, 5% makes a big difference. If you represent Victoria Lakes, 5% makes a big difference. If you represent Queens or Shelburne, 5% makes a big difference. So both our caucus and the Conservative caucus said, we feel it should stay at the 25%. To their credit, the government agreed. So we went through draft 1. Then we went through draft 2. Then draft 3. The government changed from the 20% to the 25% based on what we had agreed. Draft 4. To give you a sense of the language used, Mr. Speaker, allow me to assist. This is draft 4 that we went through in determining the terms of reference. The way it's written is, I'll give you an example. On clause 2F, on terms of reference, it says, a constituency may not deviate by a variance greater or less than 20% from the average number of electors per constituency. So that 20% eventually got changed to 25%. But, so it says right there, you can't go beyond the variance. But then the next clause, 2G, says, deviations from parity of voting power are only justified on the grounds they contribute to better governance. That's the extraordinary circumstances clause. That's the clause that was in 2002. It's the clause that was in 1992. So as we're going along, we had agreed to change 20% to 25%. We had the same extraordinary circumstances clause, looking at communities of interest, linguistic, culture, geography. That was all in there. So, to our surprise, Mr. Speaker, draft 5 showed up. Now, based on the discussions we have had, the only change that had been agreed to was to move the 20% to 25%. So we looked at draft 5. Didn't appear to be any difference. This is all fairly technical language. Then we had draft 6, draft 7. And I believe it's at draft 8.
Oh, I think we're there.
We got to draft 8. We came to look at it a bit closer. It's like, wait a minute. What happened to clause 2G that allows the deviation based on culture, language, geography, communities of interest? It had disappeared. There had been no discussion at the committee stage, where representatives are there for all of the caucuses. So maybe it was a typographical error. Maybe the clerk's office had made an error. Human error is acceptable. It happens. So the question became, who gave the instructions to remove that clause from the terms of reference? Now, yesterday, the Premier, in his response to Member from Argyll, pretty much said, we caught you sleeping. Yeah, you didn't notice. You didn't notice. You know, we put that there, it was right under your nose, and you didn't notice. You know, Mr. Speaker, that reminded me when I was thinking this morning. I remember one of the first budgets that the Ham government brought in, and they'd made a number of cuts throughout government. And when it came time for the budget debate, they refused to tell anyone where they had cut. And the Premier famously said, it's up to the opposition to ferret it out, to go line by line and try to figure out where we had made cuts. And the NDP, were the official opposition of the day, railed against that. Terrible that a government would try to do this, to try to pass something through the House without openly telling the elected members exactly what was going on. And yet yesterday, to hear the Premier say, well, we caught you napping, and it was right there and you didn't notice. What kind of a way is that to govern, Mr. Speaker? What kind of way is that to tell Nova Scotians we take this democracy seriously? We take the process of drawing electoral boundaries seriously. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was trying to think this morning of what language would be parliamentary and unparliamentary, and you'll guide me through this, but basically the message yesterday from the Premier, in all essence, was, we tricked you. We tricked you. It was right there under your nose. So two things. I immediately said, who gave the instructions? Because we didn't have any discussion here. The notes will reflect there was no discussion. Who gave the instructions? Well, Mr. Speaker, the chair was not available at the time, so we had an acting chair. That acting chair is the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island. The acting chair sent an email to the clerks instructing them to make those changes and to remove that clause from the terms of reference. There was absolutely no debate on it. Instead, it was instructions coming from the government caucus. Mr. Speaker, that's not a way to govern. It's not a way to do boundaries in an independent and impartial process, but that's how it happened. So you had the acting chair send instructions with absolutely no authority to make those changes. So let's look at the time frame of when these meetings were taking place. When the Premier says, you guys should have noticed, you should have raised it earlier. Keep in mind, the government has a majority on this committee, so whether we noticed it earlier or not really was irrelevant. But when were these meetings taking place? I'm just going to highlight the last three to give you a sense. Wednesday, December 14th. Well, can't imagine what else somebody would doing on that day other than focusing on terms of reference for Boundary Commission. Friday, December 23rd. Again, can't see how any members of the House would be distracted by anything other than the terms of reference for the Boundary Commission. What else would you be doing on Friday, December 23rd than focusing on the terms of reference for Boundary Commission? Absolutely not. Now, Mr. Speaker, we'll have more debate on this, but our meetings were in camera, but they were transcribed. Hansard was there. And I learned this morning that apparently we can't get copies of those transcripts, which I believe, Mr. Speaker, will be a question we'll be putting to you to do a ruling on as to why, when it was agreed by all of us that these meetings should be transcribed, that we're now being told you can't get access. And Nova Scotians can't get access. Mr. Speaker, the only reason we did meetings in camera was because we were talking about individuals that might be appointed to the Commission in order to protect their privacy. But the rest, the terms of reference, everything else, certainly I see no reason why this should be held secret. So here we are on Friday, December 23rd, and we're looking at the draft and saying, well, wait a minute, the extraordinary circumstances clause is gone. Who gave the authority to do this? So, Mr. Speaker, during the discussion, to give you a sense of what was going on, this is the morning of Friday, December 23rd. Government closes at noon on Friday, December 23rd. So I remember while we're having this debate, myself, the member for Argyll, the member for Dartmouth East, the member for Victoria Lakes, who can't understand how such a change was made when no debate took place in a parliamentary democracy. The member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour was very helpful in saying, look, why don't you guys hurry it up there, because the civil servants have to go home there. This government closes at noon, so why don't you hurry this up? Maybe that's why they don't want the transcripts to be released, because that was the government response from Acadian members, from elected members, to say, this isn't fair the way this was done. Hurry it up, guys. Hurry it up. Staff has to go home. That's how this came about. And when does the final meeting take place? Again, very convenient date, Friday, December 30th. Can't imagine what else people would want to be doing Friday, December 30th, other than dealing with terms of reference for the Boundaries Commission. But here we were, every one of us in the opposition. The chair himself can respond to where he was, but I can tell you where I was. I was at that meeting. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot more that I wish I would have been doing on Friday, December 30th than sitting in the committee's office trying to determine boundaries and terms of reference for the province of Nova Scotia. But here we were, and that's exactly what we were trying to accomplish. And Mr. Speaker, at the time, we had different choices as to what we could do. And we said, we're not signing off on these terms of reference. This is not what we agreed to. This is not the discussions that we had. This was the government using its majority to change the terms of reference without debate, and it was unacceptable. So what we did, for the first time in the 3 different occasions we've had to do an independent boundaries commission with a select committee, we issued a dissenting opinion. Mr. Speaker, from that point, this process was tainted. This process was tainted by the political interference of the NDP government, who used its majority to interfere directly in this process. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's suggested by the Minister of Justice, who I earlier anointed as the self-proclaimed patron saint of voter equality, to say that we need all the ridings to be equal. This is not about politics. Yet, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts. The NDP have never won Clare. They've never held Argyll. They've never held Richmond. And other than for a brief period, they haven't held Preston. I would submit to you that is why this government wanted to get rid of the extraordinary circumstances clause. Because if you look at the reaction of this government to the thought of losing their Minister of Fisheries in Shelburne, all of a sudden it's, wait a minute, Shelburne, it wasn't fair. They weren't treated fairly. I don't disagree. But I can tell you, Richmond wasn't treated fairly, nor was Clare, nor was Argyll, nor was Preston. Because I'll put up my numbers for voter participation in Richmond and the numbers for Clare, numbers for Argyll, up against any other riding. Voters in our ridings voted, they respected what they had been given by the legislature, and that they had an opportunity to have their voices heard here in the House of Assembly. Yet this government has taken the steps to eliminate those voices. And I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that if the government held Richmond, Clare, Argyll, or Preston, we would not be having this debate today. So then, Mr. Speaker, we go off. And the other matter I should point out for everyone's information is that not only was it the terms of reference, but it was deciding who would be the members of the commission. And so in looking through my notes this morning that I had as far as who would be the members of the commission, I have written down that what we were been told by the acting chair, his suggestion was 2 members for HRM, 2 members from Cape Breton, 2 members from mainland Nova Scotia, an African Nova Scotian representative, an Acadian representative, and then a chair. Mr. Speaker, it's important that Nova Scotians know. Finding Nova Scotians to serve on this Independent Boundaries Commission was an extremely difficult task. Even the government with its majority found it to be a difficult task. How difficult was it? It was so difficult that rather than going with 9 members that was foreseen, we had to agree with only going with 8 because we couldn't find a 9th person in time. So the men and women that agreed to serve on this, we owe them a great deal of gratitude. And I'll get to the members of that commission a little bit further on and the government's reaction to them. But keep in mind, even with a majority, this government could not find a 9th person. That's how difficult this process was. So we put together the commission. Nominees came from all parties. We didn't sit there and say that we're going to publicly attack our nominees based on previous voting patterns or anything else. We said these are good, competent, capable Nova Scotians. But it should serve as no surprise to Nova Scotians that we expected that the individual named to be the African Nova Scotian representative would speak for African Nova Scotians. Nor should Nova Scotians be shocked that the Acadian representative might stand up for the Acadian community. That was expected. It was expected back in 1992. It was expected in 2002. It was expected this time around as well. The only person who seems to have been shocked by that is the Premier of this province. And I'll get to that a bit further in my comments. So I have quite a bit here to get through, so I'll try to do that as well. Hopefully, there might be unanimous support for that. So out goes the commission, and the commission has its public meetings. During its public meetings, the commission is inundated with presentations from the Acadian community. Inundated. Something never been seen. In Richmond, we had almost 80 people come out. Argyll had 200.
Clare had 5.
In Clare, they had a parade. They had a parade of people marching the streets to come meet with a boundary commission. 500 people showed up at that meeting. 500 people. And when you look at the recent voter turnout here in HRM in a municipal election, 37%. 500 people in Clare came out to meet with a Boundaries Commission. And what did that commission say? It said, we looked at the terms of reference, and the language clearly says that the commission is to be guided by the following principles. And that commission said, based on that, we feel that we have the ability to look at what we've been told by Nova Scotians, to actually listen to Nova Scotians. Something that Nova Scotians tell us every day, I don't feel the government is listening to me. I don't believe the province is hearing what I have to say. And here we had a commission that said, we hear you. We hear what you're saying. When we had the presentations in Louisdale, in Richmond County, we had two presenters that came from Pumpket. Now, Pumpket's in Antigonish County. That's not a protected seat. But Pumpket's an Acadian community. And they came in and they said to the commission, you need to understand, the member for Richmond, the member for Argyll, the member for Clare, don't just represent Acadians in their constituencies. They represent all of us throughout Nova Scotia. They are our voice in the legislature, even though the member is from Richmond, he speaks for Acadians in Pumpket, he speaks for us in Shettycamp, he speaks for us in Sydney, in HRM, Greenwood, South Shore, and the entire French Shore. That was the message. And I believe the commission members at that point, a light went off and said, wait a minute, we hadn't really considered this. We thought these were just the areas that were being represented, and that was the only voice the Acadians had. But they made it very clear. And I believe there was presentations either in Clare or Argyll from representatives from Greenwood that gave the same message. We realize we're too small of a community and we're geographically located where it's impossible to have our own riding. But we look to the representatives from the Acadian communities in the legislature to be there to defend our rights, to defend our interests, and to support us. We knew that. The member for Argyll knew that. The member for Clare knew that. But the commission, I don't believe, understood that. I don't believe many Nova Scotians may have understood it either. So the commission came back and said, based on what we've heard, we're an independent commission. We believe that we should maintain the ridings of Argyll, Richmond, Clare, and Preston. Mr. Speaker, that day was a victory for democracy. That day was a victory for the Nova Scotians who had taken the time to come out and to express their concerns to that independent commission. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of the interesting things I wanted to highlight to members of the House as well is that one of the strongest reactions within the Acadian community to the thought of losing their ridings in the legislature, it didn't come from seniors, wasn't from teachers, wasn't from those we would expect. In fact, in this again, wasn't even from voters. The strongest reaction and the most passionate reaction that came from the youth. It came from the students in the Acadian schools throughout the province of Nova Scotia. 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds who don't even have the right to vote demanded meetings with the Minister of Acadian Affairs, came to the commission and made presentations. In my school, École Beauport, they made a video that they put on YouTube. Very respectful. The students there are holding messages in front of them, conveying that they feel like they're being silenced and that this is a part of their identity, it's a part of their culture. We saw the same types of demonstrations down in the South Shore, in Clare and Argyll, and the French Shore, where high school students, Mr. Speaker, I would submit to you, you probably have to go back to the Vietnam War to see students have this type of reaction and the type of interest in an issue that we saw over these boundaries. Mr. Speaker, that was something that we should be celebrating as a province. At a time when we can't get young people to vote, where the numbers are abysmal for voter participation from 18 to 25, it's now even growing probably up to 35 now, and here you had young people taking such an active interest in this issue. And Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, I had shivers go through my body when I received a text from my niece, who said, Minogue, the principal just announced that the Boundary Commission is keeping the Acadian ridings. She said the school erupted in cheer. I dare any member of the government to tell us when's the last time that their students erupted in cheer over their ridings, over their boundaries. Mr. Speaker, that happened in Acadian schools throughout the province. Which, what better way to send a message to this government that these are not just electoral boundaries? And again, let me say it, I've said it many times, I'm going to say it again. This is not about the political future of myself, or the member for Argyll, or the member for Clare. This is part of the survival of a community, part of the survival of a culture, part of a survival of a language. It's part of a future. Mr. Speaker, when this whole process started, I said, the government doesn't understand what they're doing. Because if they think they're only taking on Richmond, Clare, and Argyll, they're wrong. Because, Mr. Speaker, Acadians are throughout the province of Nova Scotia. In fact, the single largest population of Acadians right now is in Halifax Regional Municipality. And the other point that I've made, and I wish to reiterate again, the success that the Acadian culture has had in Nova Scotia, success such as Université Saint-Anne, French language university here in Nova Scotia, the Conseil scolaire acadien provincial, the French language school board, which, allow me to add, is the only school board that saw an increase in students in the province of Nova Scotia. Halifax Regional School Board didn't have it. Cape Breton Regional School Board, we certainly know, didn't have it. But the Conseil scolaire acadien provincial had it. And we look at the French language services law that we have here in this province. Mr. Speaker, Acadians will be the first to tell you this could not have been achieved with only the support of Acadians. Because at the end of the day, on the best day, we were 3 of 52 in the legislature. 3 of 52 doesn't win votes. Instead, it was the support of the majority, who are not Acadians, who said, we respect this culture. We respect these people. We respect their identity. We respect their future. And we're prepared to give our support. And that's why we've had that success. And it couldn't have been done without the support of Nova Scotians. And when Nova Scotians saw this government attacking Acadians, they weren't happy. And in fact, we even have scientific information to back that up. CRA did a poll, asked the question, should these protected ridings be maintained? 47% said no, but 41% said yes. As Don Mills said in his release, you can pretty much say that's even. But what's more importantly, what he said was that it's a no-win situation for the government. And it was a no-win situation from the start, and they should have known that. But when you put politics ahead of good public policy, this is what you get. And in their obsession to get rid of seats they could not win, they were prepared to go down the road of bad public policy. And it's coming back to haunt them today. Because, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are speaking loud and clear about this. And let me add to that, Mr. Speaker. The process of reviewing boundaries is a difficult process, not only for Nova Scotians, especially for members here of the House. I'm not standing in my place to say I'm happy that the riding of Cape Breton Nova has disappeared. I'm saddened by that. I'm saddened at the possibility of losing a colleague. I'm saddened by a voice being lost from Cape Breton Island in this legislature. I'm not happy about the prospect that Shelburne may be split in two and losing its representative. I wasn't pleased when the interim report came out to say that the member for Pictou East could be losing his riding. I was saddened because I think all of us are here with the best of interests. We all have a great attachment to our communities, and the thought of losing those voices and losing those ridings is an unfortunate one. But the reality is, every 10 years, it's a process we have to go through, as difficult as that is. So, Mr. Speaker, we're at the interim report. As I said, a victory for democracy. So everyone's waiting to see what's the government's reaction going to be? Well, the select committee that created the Independent Boundaries Commission no longer existed. So you couldn't go back to them to say, now what do we do with this interim report? So what happens is that the Minister of Justice comes out and says, I'm rejecting the interim report. Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe there was a point of privilege raised today, and I believe you'll see more, where you will be asked to judge under what legislative authority did the Minister of Justice tell that independent commission that the report was being rejected and to go back and start again. Where in the House of Assembly Act does it give the Minister of Justice that authority? So naturally, when the Minister of Justice said that, we looked and he said, I've received a legal opinion telling me that the Independent Boundaries Commission went beyond their mandate. So naturally, when you get a legal opinion, one questions, well, what opinion was given? So I wrote immediately to the Chief Legislative Counsel and said, well, who gave the Minister of Justice that opinion? So I emailed him and said, I'd like to see that opinion. Because we're members of the opposition, we're members of this House. I think we all have a right to see that opinion, because a parliamentary democracy works when you have an opposition that can question opinions that are given, or that can seek alternative opinions to see if they match up. So here's the response that I received, dated Friday, June 15, 2012, from Mr. Gordon Hebb, Chief Legislative Counsel. Dear Mr. Sampson, my opinion respecting the interim report of the Electoral Boundaries Commission was an oral, not a written opinion, and therefore I obviously cannot provide a copy of it to you. I have a research memorandum prepared for me by my staff in preparation for a meeting with Justice. That memorandum constitutes only part of the basis for my opinion. I am not prepared to provide a copy of it to you because, one, it is not my complete opinion or the sole basis for it, and two, regardless, I consider my advice to the Attorney General or to any MLA to be confidential. Mr. Speaker, how are we, as members of the opposition, to question that opinion when we can't see it, when we can't receive a copy of it? So a Minister of Justice under questionable authority, which we look forward to seeing your ruling on what authority he had to carry this out, based his decision on an oral opinion. So, Mr. Speaker, how can we, as members of the opposition, say, look, we agree with that opinion, that was a sound basis for making that decision on behalf of the House of Assembly, when we can't see it, and we've never been given that opinion? Mr. Speaker, how can anyone say that that opinion given to the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice, on behalf of all members of this legislature should be confidential and not provided to us? Because our democracy is not working when that's the case. Because this is not an issue with the Department of Justice. It's not an issue internally to his department. This is an issue, with all due respect, Mr. Speaker, under your jurisdiction, on behalf of all members of this House of Assembly. And I would submit to you, and I would request you, that you demand a copy, or you demand that something be put in writing as to what that opinion was, and that it be shared with the members of this legislature. Because if not, our House is not functioning the way it's supposed to function. 15? So allow me to continue, Mr. Speaker. So the Minister of Justice comes out and says he rejects the report, never brought it back to the House of Assembly. I believe, in fact, Mr. Speaker, if I'm not mistaken, you sent a letter to the Commission when they asked for whether they should be given letters of appointment or not, and in your response, it clearly stated that following their terms of reference being issued, no other person or body shall be providing them further direction. It's language along those lines. Which to the Commission, they said, well, wait a minute, the Speaker's telling us no one else is supposed to tell us what to do, but the Minister of Justice rejected our report and now tells us go back and do it again. And don't come back, I dare you not to come back with protecting the ridings of Richmond, Clare, Argyll, or Preston. Get rid of them. That is what our instructions were. Mr. Speaker, the Commission had two options. They could have resigned en masse. They could have walked away. To their credit, they decided that they would try again. Now, ironically, Mr. Speaker, and I'll tie this back in further in my remarks, but one of the Commission members, when the Independent Commission came back and said we should keep the protected ridings, one of the Commission members resigned. Dr. Jill Grant resigned. She had her reasons. She provided dissenting opinion, and we respected that. I didn't hear one member of this House say anything negative about her decision to resign. Not one. No one questioned her dissenting opinion. She was entitled to that. And she was given the due respect that she deserved as a hardworking Nova Scotian that we asked to serve on the Independent Commission. So now the Commission goes back, round two. In round two, there are others who will speak as to what was suggested regarding Yarmouth, what was suggested regarding Pictou, what was suggested regarding other areas of the province. I'm not going to bother getting into that detail. When their final report came in, Mr. Speaker, Paul Godet, who was the representative that was asked to be there for the Acadians, gave a dissenting opinion. Mr. Speaker, he had every right to give his dissenting opinion. He was there to represent Acadians. The first report had recommended keeping the Acadian ridings. The final report, at the end of the day, after the government interference, suggested getting rid of them. So he provided a dissenting opinion, which he was entitled to. Mr. Speaker, the vicious personal attack that followed by the Premier of Nova Scotia against another Nova Scotian that we asked to come serve on that commission was unprecedented. It was an embarrassment. I can tell you I was personally embarrassed as a member of this House to watch a Premier go out and make such a vicious attack. Whether it be Paul Godet or whether it be any other Nova Scotian, no one deserves the attack that took place by the Premier of this province against Mr. Godet. Mr. Speaker, we'll have the opportunity to question further some of the comments that were made by the Premier regarding Mr. Godet and the language that was used. But, Mr. Speaker, I believe Nova Scotians were horrified. I think the editorial cartoon in the Herald the day after was proof of Nova Scotians' reaction. I believe they had poor Mr. Godet tied up and gagged by the Premier. Imagine such a public attack by the top official in the province of Nova Scotia. And for Nova Scotians, they should be asking themselves, who's next? And I can tell you, back home, people were like, who is this Premier? Because that's not the same person that led the NDP in opposition for all those years. Who is this person? How did he change in 3 years in government? That now politics is the driving force, not the best interests of Nova Scotians. Surviving his majority government and getting re-elected is the driving mandate, not the best interests of Nova Scotians. And when you see a Premier make such a personal and vicious attack against a fellow Nova Scotian, you know that it's a Premier that has reached the point of desperation. And all Nova Scotians should be asking, who's next that will be attacked by this Premier? Mr. Speaker, yesterday in this House, I had the opportunity to ask a question to the new Minister of Acadian Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I asked a question in French, my first language, the first language of Acadians, first language of Francophones. Mr. Speaker, I did not do so that other members would not be able to understand what I was asking. I did so because I was speaking in the language of those who were affected by the question I was asking. And I want to thank you for allowing me, Mr. Speaker, to put the question in French. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say as well, and I told him personally, I'll say it again. Afterwards, when the minister responded in French, a very good effort on his part. As I told him personally, I'm not going to say, I liked your answer, but I liked the way you delivered your answer. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that Acadians who were watching, and I'm sure the representatives of the Acadian Federation who may not have liked the minister's answer, as Acadians, in many ways we wanted to applaud the minister and say thank you for speaking to us in our first language. And thank you for... Because, Mr. Speaker, Acadians, again, are asking the question, what did we do? What did we do wrong? Tell us. Tell us how we can make things better. What is it that the NDP feels we should have done that we didn't do? Mr. Speaker, there's only one conclusion. The Acadians don't vote NDP. And that's why they got what they got from this government. And what a sad day. What a sad day again. The 3 ridings that have the highest voter turnout every election, something that should be celebrated and something that should be bragged about by the Premier and the members of this government. Instead, the Acadians have become a political nuisance. Because, Mr. Speaker, they haven't elected an NDP, and God willing, it'll never happen either. But, Mr. Speaker, that is their choice. And they should not be being punished today for having made that choice. Mr. Speaker, this is a process that Nova Scotians should be able to say, it's a difficult process, redrawing boundaries, but we can at least rest assured it was done on an independent, impartial basis to no particular benefit of any political party. No Nova Scotian can say this about this report. No Nova Scotian can say this about Bill 94. In fact, at the press conference announcing the final report, when Jim Bickerton, professor, well-respected professor at St. FX, was asked, do you feel that this report was impartial and was done in a fair manner? And he said no. And he said, I don't expect any Nova Scotian to see it that way either. So, Mr. Speaker, what a sad day. A sad day for the Premier, a sad day for government in Nova Scotia to have such a respected Nova Scotian say, Nova Scotians really have no reason to have confidence in this report having been done in an impartial manner because of the repeated interference that took place by this government from day one. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to again reiterate the ability of members of this House to be able to stand in their place and speak in their mother tongue. To speak French, I think is something for us to celebrate. Again, I reiterate, Mr. Speaker, I find it unfortunate we do not have simultaneous translation in this House because there's nothing I would like more than all of my colleagues could understand, and yourself, Mr. Speaker, could understand when we are speaking French. And I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing that I like hearing more than when the member for Inverness stands up and speaks Gaelic. That's something that we should be cherishing here in this province. It's part of our identity. It's something to be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the thought that any government in Nova Scotia would want to silence the voices of Acadians, the voices of Gaelic Nova Scotians, or the voices of any other Nova Scotia cultural community is absolutely embarrassing. Yet that is in essence what has been done by this government. It has been a deliberate attempt to silence Acadians, and the question is, who's next? And Mr. Speaker, I would say that the recent numbers that have come out regarding languages spoken, I believe is only a matter of time before we see even more languages spoken in the House of Assembly, which I believe is a wonderful thing. And look forward to seeing debate taking place and speeches taking place in various other languages here in this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, as I said, it's with mixed feelings that I spoke on Bill 94. I was proud to have been asked by our leader to be part of this process again. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I have to say it's absolutely embarrassing to see what was done by this government, and again done on the basis of pure politics. Monsieur le Président, je veux prendre cette occasion aussi pour remercier tous les membres de la communauté acadienne à travers la Nouvelle-Écosse pour leur intérêt, pour leur appui, pour les présentations qui ont été faites à la Commission, les 2-3 fois la Commission s'est rencontrée, ceux qui vont venir au comité sur les amendements aussi. Et je veux certainement remercier la Fédération acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse et toutes les autres organisations, particulièrement Ron Robichaud, l'ancien président de la Fédération acadienne, pour tout son travail, Jean Légère, ancien directeur général de la Fédération acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse, et maintenant le nouveau président, Justin Murray, qui vient de chez nous. et Marie-Claude Rioux, qui est la nouvelle directrice générale. Monsieur le Président, les Acadiens sont un peuple fier. Les Acadiens sont un peuple qui cherche au futur. On se trouve dans une mer anglaise. On se trouve dans une mer qui est de plus en plus difficile de maintenir notre langue, de maintenir notre culture. Mais nous sommes un peuple qui a eu beaucoup de succès ici en Nouvelle-Écosse. C'est un succès qui est venu avec l'appui de la majorité des gens en Nouvelle-Écosse qui ne sont pas acadiens. Et on apprécie l'appui qu'il nous a donné. Mais aujourd'hui, la communauté acadienne, il faut se demander la question. Le gouvernement de Premier Dexter est prêt de s'en débarrasser de les circonscriptions protégées par la communauté acadienne. Qu'est-ce qui est la prochaine chose qu'ils vont vouloir nous arracher? Est-ce que c'est l'Université Sainte-Anne? Est-ce que c'est les écoles du Conseil scolaire acadien provincial? Est-ce que c'est la loi sur les services en la langue française à la province de Nouvelle-Écosse? Je veux vous dire, Monsieur le Président, que je vais continuer de faire tout ce que je peux comme député de Richmond, comme Acadien, pour défendre notre langue, défendre notre culture et, plus important, défendre la voix des Acadiens élus ici dans la province de Nouvelle-Écosse pour s'asseoir ici dans l'Assemblée législative pour défendre les droits de la communauté acadienne et de travailler avec tous les députés au nom du meilleur et le bien-être de la province de Nouvelle-Écosse, la culture acadienne et toutes les autres cultures ici en Nouvelle-Écosse. Merci, M. le Président.
Thank you very much. I would remind the honourable member that there was some correspondence that he read from his speech I would like to see tabled. There was an email that you read from there during the speech. I'd like to, and also you asked about unparliamentary language. I would say that if during that speech I had an opportunity to look at Beauchesne, and trickery is an unparliamentary word, so tricked would also be an unparliamentary word. So I would like to thank the honourable member for a passionate speech, and I recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. C'est une question intéressante qu'on va discuter pendant les prochaines quelques personnes qui vont parler des frontières électorales en Nouvelle-Écosse. Et vraiment, de dire c'est un processus qui a été assez disappointing. Mr. Speaker, I got to say, over the next number of speakers, you will be hearing a very common theme of a very disappointing process.